very good of you to be here this morning. I'm Charles Haynes. I direct the Religious Freedom Education Project of the First Amendment Center. And on behalf of that project and the Interfaith Alliance and our other supporters of this document, I'd like to welcome you. Today, the Religious Freedom Education Project of the First Amendment Center and the Interfaith Alliance, together with 21 other religious, civil liberties, and human rights organizations, release What is the Truth About Muslims? Questions and Answers. With one voice, we affirm the First Amendment guarantee of religious liberty for Americans of all faiths and none. Drafted over a period of 9 months and vetted by religious liberty experts and scholars of Islam, our document answers key questions raised by anti-Muslim groups in the United States over the past decade. Our aim is to provide the public with balanced and accurate information about religious freedom and American Muslims in order to counter the dangerous and often vicious propaganda that has helped fuel the dramatic rise of Islamophobia in the United States. According to a study conducted by the Center for American Progress in 2011, anti-Muslim organizations in the United States have spent more than $40 million over the past decade to convince Americans that Islam is inherently violent and oppressive, and that Muslims in America intend to subvert our laws by imposing their own. This self-described Stop the Islamization of America movement is orchestrating efforts to pass anti-Sharia laws in some 23 states, helping to generate anti-mosque protests in more than 50 communities, and in general contributing to an atmosphere of anger and hate that provokes acts of intimidation and violence, including the recent tragic attack on a Sikh temple in Wisconsin, where 6 people were murdered apparently because the killer confused Sikhs with Muslims. In my view, this campaign to spread hate and fear is the most significant threat to religious freedom in America today. Since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the anti-Muslim narrative has migrated from the right-wing fringe into the mainstream political arena and is now parroted by a growing number of political and religious leaders. What is the Truth About American Muslims responds to the propaganda about creeping Sharia in our courts by accurately defining the term Sharia and explaining that the U.S. Constitution prohibits American courts or other government agencies from substituting any religious law for American law. We warn that legislation barring any consideration of foreign law or religious law in the courts has the effect of potentially marginalizing and discriminating against all religious communities in America who have practiced their religious beliefs and customs peacefully for centuries in the United States. We also provide concise answers to frequently asked questions about American Muslims, including accurate information about the role of mosques, the views of American Muslim leaders on extremist violence, and some of the beliefs and practices of American Muslims that are widely misrepresented and misunderstood. In a world plagued by extremists acting in the name of Islam, it goes without saying that the American people have every reason to be worried about homegrown terrorism. The vast majority of American Muslims strongly share that concern. That's why so many imams preach and work against extremism, and that's why many American Muslims actively help law enforcement foil terrorist plots. But unnecessary and dangerous anti-Sharia laws, alarmist claims about mosques in the neighborhood, and ugly attempts to paint all Muslims with the terrorist brush, well, these are all red herrings that divert Americans from our shared goal of fighting extremism of all varieties and securing our safety and freedom. Now, we don't have a $40 million war chest with which to correct the record, but we do have the convening power to to bring together civil libertarians, religious leaders, and scholars to say with one voice, enough is enough. Here is the truth about American Muslims. I'd like to introduce Reverend Gaddy, who is, of course, the Executive Director of the Interfaith Alliance, for his opening statement. Welcome.
Thank you for being here. I think you will pick up as we go an expected and intentional redundancy of comments. It's, however, important that we say it as many times as we can until it gets in people's heads and begins to affect their thoughts and hearts. Charles Haynes is a good friend and a colleague, as well as a smart and devoted advocate for religious freedom. I don't want to go on without saying I'm grateful for an opportunity for the two of us to work together personally and professionally through Interfaith Alliance and the Religious Freedom Education Project. I'm also grateful and want to say so for Ariel Gingold in our office, who has been the person most connected with this project and has dogged it to see that we do it as well as we can do it. Why? Why another project on Islam? Why another publication on Islam? Neither Charles nor I is a Muslim. Neither of our organizations has a singular sectarian interest or sponsorship. So why spend our time and energy on this particular project? Anyone interested in religious freedom knows that when one religion is under attack in this nation, no religion is free from similar circumstances. When a community blocks the building of a mosque, what prevents that community from doing the same for a church or a synagogue or a gurdwara? If we outlaw Muslim practices such as the anti-Sharia measures seek to do, we weaken the First Amendment and we endanger everyone's right to practice their faith as the Constitution guarantees. Allowing elected officials to demonize one faith in order to gain political ground ignores our nation's history as a beacon of freedom and a refuge for the oppressed. That history, our national history, instructs us. Jews and Catholics, people with no faith tradition, and individuals in evangelical traditions like Baptist pioneers in Universalism and Unitarianism know well and experientially about the need for other support from other religions when any one of our religions is being misunderstood, mischaracterized, and irrationally made unwelcome in this land. Unless all religions are free in the United States, no religion is assured freedom. Pay attention to the news and look around, and you will hear and see and read the reasons we have done this work. Our neighbors in New York City, like now those of us who reside in our nation's capital, are seeing firsthand venomous advertisements equating Islam and savagery. Over the past several months, we have watched a small number of affluent power brokers finance a shameless movement to scare people into supporting legislation to ban Sharia law, though the United States Constitution, as Charles has pointed out already, protects the citizens of this nation from the authority of any law that attempts to transcend our founding document. I'm sad to say that even some campaigning politicians who are more interested in winning a vote than healing our nation have spread untruths about Islam and its devotees both in this land and abroad. by breaking with our historical tradition and setting in place a very questionable precedent for the future, a House subcommittee for the first time has investigated one particular religion, Islam, seeking to give some foundation for the chairman's concerns about radicalization, an effort that should make any person in every religion nervous. Most simply stated, the frequently asked questions document is intended to help people know the truth about Islam. The FAQ enables people to be spared of an agenda-driven fear and to be done with a negative movement born of misinformation so that all can know the truth about Islam and be prepared to get to know American Muslims as our neighbors. Nothing gives weight to bigotry more than ignorance. That is why we want to make it easy for people to know the facts and truths about Islam. Toward that end, we will disseminate this document broadly, placing it in the hands of over 1,500 elected officials, including members of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, as well as their staff members. The FAQ will be given to attorneys general and governors in states needlessly pressured to consider anti-Sharia legislation. We're very proud of the diverse groups that have spoken with one voice in endorsing this document. These groups will join us in sharing this document with related materials to help facilitate discussions on the document throughout our organizations, involving our local affiliates as well as our national offices. I hope that congregations across the spectrums of religion in America will devote time to study this document, and I have a similar desire related to school boards and educational administrators and instructors in cities and states. Now let's be sure of one thing. This document will not benefit those who favor prejudice and bigotry over education and community. Those who manipulate Islam as well as other religions to advance their own partisan interest will likely ignore it. But people who know the liberating power of truth will find the document helpful, and devotees of no religion ever need fear truth. We believe, as did the founders of this nation and most of the religions and citizens who call this nation home, that an educated public is one that insists on freedoms and rights for all people and refuses to allow extremists of any group to prevail over the liberty, justice, and peace that are the goals of our faiths and of our democracy. Rich Cizik is the next speaker.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Gaddy, Dr. Charles Haynes, my other guests here on the panel. I would like to speak to you as the president of the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good about the guide which has been produced. First of all, a quick word about the New Evangelical Partnership. We exist as evangelicals because we believe in love over anger, unity over division. We believe in a broad agenda of issues that are concerned to evangelicals, not a few litmus test issues. We know what those are. And lastly, we believe in a faith that is not sublimated to political ideology, but is above ideology. And that distinguishes us from the old guard, from the religious right, and others here in America, who we believe are part of the problem. There's an expression in English, maybe you know it, it goes like this: necessity is the mother of invention. Well, I would suggest to you that Americans want to get to know their Muslim neighbors and the faith which they have. But it's also very true, secondly, that there is misunderstanding about who their Muslim neighbors are and whether and how these neighbors of theirs fit into the American scene and the American heritage. Let me cite for you a recent poll that was done in the wake of the 2010 midterm elections, in which evangelicals, it was found, now this is my constituency, was found to believe by a majority that Islam and Muslims by extension are not part of our shared American values. That's an astonishing figure. I believe it was close to 60%. It reveals the problem that we're here about today and why the guide, which has been produced by my colleagues here, is so important. Let's be clear. For our founding fathers, religious liberty was the first liberty. It was precious, is precious. It is foundational. It is the right that secures, in my opinion, all the other freedoms. But for some today, even in my community of the evangelicals, religious freedom is treated as a second-class right. It is inferior to freedoms of speech and assembly. And for Muslims, religious liberty is perceived to be, well, it is best private, but not public. Why do I say that? It's evident by the opposition to the construction of mosques around the country, which ought to be welcomed, not fought. Why? Because they are a representation of what we as America have always stood for to the rest of the world, religious freedom, and yet we know today it is not so well modeled. And this anti-Muslim bigotry about which we are here today is an example. The New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, as an example, has created a new film called Islam in America, The Christian Truth. It's designed to combat Islamophobia, and I would recommend to you, it can be found by that title on the YouTube web and elsewhere. There is a need that the guide addresses, and we know it will be effective. Why? Because we faced these challenges in this country before. It was faced by Catholics, it was faced by Jews, it was faced by Muslims and others. And the extension of full religious freedom, First Amendment rights will occur for Muslims, I'm confident, in America. But it can't come soon enough. And those First Amendment and goodwill rights, quite frankly, we know are not being realized by our fellow citizens who are Muslims. It takes work. Equal religious liberty for all, we say in this country, is an ongoing quest. It's not easily achieved once and for all. It's an ongoing effort. And so the questions that the guide answers, for example, the construction of mosques, is incredibly helpful because it explains how mosques are actually forces for social and political integration and are actually important for evangelicals because they build that kind of community integration that is so important for America as a beacon to the rest of the world. And as for these 24+ Sharia laws, well, the guide explains just exactly how passing these kinds of infringements is actually an infringement upon our evangelical rights and the rights of other religions in America. So it's that helpful. In sum, religious liberty is a right that is rooted and grounded in the inviolable dignity of the human person. And for people of faith, let me say this, it is not just a gift from God, religious liberty, it is a duty to God. And so I would suggest that as groups, the many different groups that have endorsed this document, especially evangelicals, should distribute it, use it for study in churches and the rest as a gift back to God, as part of our duty to Him. Not just a civic duty, but a religious duty. Imagine that happening. I say that as an evangelical who respects Islam and my Muslim friends and believers. And thus I conclude by saying, we must bridge this divide that exists in America. It's crucial because the vicious cycle of culture wars that have waged in this country for so many years, even decades, can be seen now in the rhetoric of the conflict of civilizations that has come. Now, I find that an arguable term, even arguable in existence. But nonetheless, the culture wars and the rhetoric of the culture wars are being extended to this argument, to this debate. And finally, let me say, there are divides between Christians and Muslims. They're theological, but they certainly aren't over religious freedom. They shouldn't be over religious liberty for all. I applaud the Interfaith Alliance and the First Amendment Project, religious education project of the First Amendment Center for having done this. To quote it, full religious freedom depends on the courage and commitment of ordinary citizens to stand up for the rights of their fellow citizens. And as we evangelicals would say, amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich Cizik, for a very powerful statement, endorsement. I would like to introduce another speaker, but first let me say, I mean, Welton Gaddy said it about me, I say it about him. What a great partner the Interfaith Alliance has been on this project. And of course, there's no one in the country who has done more to speak for the interfaith work that we have to do in this country than Welton Gaddy and the Interfaith Alliance. Now, Welton mentioned that neither of us is a Muslim. So drafting this, we needed help. So the drafting committee, we were very, very fortunate to have Wajahat Ali, who is a lawyer and a playwright, and is not with us today, but certainly had a great hand in this, and Dr. Hussein Rashid, who is an American Muslim scholar and very important voice in this process as well. So I'm going to ask Dr. Rashid if he would say a few words, and then we'll take your questions.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us this morning, and I want to thank both the Religious Freedom Education Project at the First Amendment Center and the Interfaith Alliance for putting together this project and making sure it comes to fruition. And in particular, it's been such a joy working with both organizations, so thank you so much for inviting myself and both my colleague Wajahat Ali and myself to contribute to the drafting committee here. It is important, I think, that this document has a push from outside the Muslim community, because we have to understand how important this is as part of American civic life, the questions that are raised here, but that the voices come from experts who have knowledge of Islam as a religion, the community of Muslims in America, and with voices from within the community. Because I think this is how you get an authentic representation of some of the debates that are going on. I think if I were to sum up what this document means and what its importance is that yes, there are threats to religious liberty. And yes, it is coming down on Muslims. And yes, it's part of a cycle that's happened to Jews and Catholics and other Christian communities in the past. And as a scholar of religion, I see it happening to other religious communities in the future with Sikhs and Hindus. If we do not address a core problem that we have, which is a question of religious literacy. And so when we look at this document, it talks about what is the truth about American Muslims, because this is the community we're talking about now. But if I had my druthers, if I had my $40 million, we would have guides on what is the truth about Jewish Americans and Catholic Americans and Evangelical Americans and Hindu Americans. Because what we have is a fundamental problem in trying to understand somebody else's religious traditions. And so having voices from within those traditions speak and having experts from about those traditions speak is an important part. If you look at very many of the questions that are posed within this document, you will see that these are the same questions that were asked of Jews a century ago, that were asked of Catholics 70, 80 years ago, and that will be asked of future communities. And so this is an important way for us to say, well, if I were asked these questions about my own faith community, how would I answer them? And hopefully in the way we've structured it, in the parallels we've created, most people will say, I don't think I would have answered any differently. I see this in myself. And we understand that very many of the struggles we face, that faithful communities face, are in fact very similar. Again, that's not to elide the very deep theological differences, but the ways in which we live our lives are very much common in this country. And so hopefully that comes forward. But I think one of the things that has come forward in the last couple of weeks, particularly in light of the debacle around the innocence of Muslim films and the New York City subway ads and the subway ads here in Washington, D.C. now, is that there is a pool of distrust, a pool of religious ignorance that comes and gives rise not just to anti-Muslim bigotry, not just to Islamophobia, but also anti-Semitism. So when you look at these films, when you look at the language that's being used against Muslims, this comes from a pool that is shared with anti-Semitism, with anti-Catholic sentiment. It is about fear of the other and of the unknown. And hopefully one of the things that will come out of this guide, when we see all these attacks on the Muslim community coming forward, is a response that says we as religious people are not going to stand for this, that other religious communities are not going to stand for this. And in New York, I'm very pleased to say that we did see that response. In fact, one of our endorsers of this guide, Rabbis for Human Rights North America, ran a series of counter subway ads. Sojourners ran a series of counter ads. United Methodist Women ran a series of counter ads, because this isn't about one religious community, that we need to be better together, because the issues, challenges, problems, questions that we face are in fact shared. And so hopefully that comes through this document as well. And it really is not just about answering questions about the American Muslim community, but about building better institutions, better engagement, and strengthening the civic fabric in America that this document opens the door towards. So thank you again so much for your time this morning. We look forward to your questions.
Well, I think now we'll open it up to questions and to any of us, and we will. We'd like you, though, to wait for a microphone when you are called on, simply so we can have this recorded properly. I'll start over here and move over across the room. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen.
Could you tell us?
Jafar with Al Mayadeen TV, Lebanon. Some of the evangelical leaders in the not too distant past have actually been espousing anti-Arab and anti-Muslim positions prior to this Islamophobia that has swept the country. I just wondered why would, or what are the reasons that a faith that espouses love, peace, and tolerance would end up sowing bigotry and hatred? And my second question is, can you give us some examples of how has been the reception within the evangelical community of this Interfaith Alliance project? Thank you.
Why don't you do the first part and I'll do the second?
Gosh, you give me the toughest question of all, well, namely explaining why. Hard to know. Fear. I've worked on issues like the environment, climate change, and I spent a lot of time with social science researchers at the University of Michigan recently, and they were reminded of Ernest Becker's study in the 1960s on terror management. It was actually called the denial of death. It's a very interesting theory by some social scientists that what happens when people have fear or reminded of death, witness the 9/11 attack, they have very strong reactions. I remember, for example, one occasion sitting in the National Cathedral with two very famous religious right leaders, Dr. James Dobson and Jerry Falwell, and I was seated, ushered in to be seated at the National Service of Remembrance for the victims of 9/11, and one of the individuals turned around to me and said, "Richard, you know this was an attack on us." I said, "Excuse me?" And it was repeated. "This attack on 9/11 was an attack against Christians," was the comment. I said, "I beg to differ." And we then had a mini debate going there in the alcove of the National Cathedral just a few days after this horrific act at the World Trade Center. Nonetheless, my point in answering the question is by saying that fear evokes strong reactions. And what among those reactions are we talking about? Well, one, social scientists say people defend their cultural conceptions of reality. Number 2, they punish those who deviate. Number 3, they reward their cultural heroes. And 4, they denigrate those with whom they disagree. Wow. That is a kind of mortality salience that social scientists refer to that may help explain what's going on. We do know that what happens is there is a failure to live up to their highest and best ideals as Christians. That is what has occurred. And for that, I apologize.
I'll pick up where Rich left off, because I also come out of the Christian evangelical tradition. One thing that comes to my mind first is that in that tradition, I was taught a lot more about certainty than I was about humility. Humility wasn't a very big value in our church. It was more about we're right and everybody else is wrong. And some people in that tradition have been shaped by religious leaders who wanted them not to be open because it was a matter of securing their faith and fear that if there was any infringement on that faith at all, they would lose the faith entirely. And an inconsistency really with what the Christian scriptures teach about the power and the potential of truth and openness to truth. I had a lot of friends who prized our truth more than a pursuit of truth to expand our truth. The Interfaith Alliance has had a mixture of reactions about our mission all along. Our major mission is looking at the intersection of religion, politics, and government and trying to give independence to each of those entities so that they're not confused to a point that you can't tell religion from politics, and you have politicians sounding like preachers and wanting to legislate scripture, and then you have people in religious leadership positions who want to use the government to advance their particular religion. So we get a variety of responses. And frankly, it is even more difficult today than it has been in the past, because now we have lost a consensus on the very meaning of religious freedom. A person said to me just last week after a speech, don't you know that the Constitution meant by religious freedom that the church would be protected from the state? And I said, well, no, I don't know that. But I know that that's what revisionist historians have been teaching, and they've had a lot of money to inculcate that kind of message in people's minds. We feel like we're doing our best work at the Interfaith Alliance when we're catching some flack from both the right and the left, because no one has a purity on this matter. There's always a willingness to give a little more than we think to give, and we're not radicalized by it, to use the subcommittee's language, but I will tell you that we're pretty hard-headed about the religious freedom clauses in the Constitution, because we actually believe that for the good of religion and for the good of this government, the two need to institutionally function separately, because history tells us, not American history, but all of history tells us, that when you intermingle those two, it hurts both, and religion usually suffers the most.
And I have to also comment, because it's a very important question, and I'd like to answer it by adding to what Welton just said, a word in praise of the First Amendment. Because what your question raises is the long story of history, which we can't rehearse here, of tension between Christians and Muslims, between Islam and Christianity. Of course, that's a long and difficult history, a violent and bloody history in many respects. And so people carry that memory. And in the United States, of course, there are some religious groups and leaders among evangelicals and other Christian groups that have actually long thought that there was a threat from Islam. and looked with some concern at the growth of the numbers of Muslims in Europe and then in the United States. And so that's been under the surface for quite a while. These events of the last decade, I think, just helped to bring it to the surface, what's been there, and frankly, use this, what's called the war on terrorism, as an opportunity to say what they've wanted to say all along. And so it's kind of an opportunity, if you will, for this long story to be recast and reaffirmed. And that has really deepened our problem and our challenge. It's one of the challenges we had here, because on one hand, of course, we want to speak about the dangers of extremism and violence, as do American Muslims want to speak about that and to warn. But at the same time, we're dealing with people who've conflated terrorism and Islam for their own purposes, for their historic purposes. So we have to try to counter that. And so the word in praise of the First Amendment is, as Welton suggested, this arrangement in religious freedom. For the first time in human history, we have in this country an arrangement where people can have very deeply different views about religions and about everything else, sometimes views that we find offensive. And yet the First Amendment arrangement protects us, if we keep it in place and we work, it protects us to, yes, robustly debate, to argue, to even offend one another, but to do it in a way that keeps us from going for the jugular, keeps us from violence. So I am all for the marketplace of ideas, but of course in the First Amendment world, our mantra is, the answer to speech you don't like is more speech, not less speech. We don't want to censor these folks who are spreading this propaganda. That's their right to do. But the answer to that is to drown them out with what we consider to be the truth.
If I can just chime in on the first question as well, which is, I think this idea, and I think what this guide attempts to do, is if it is about asking other faith communities to understand the experience of Muslims in America compared to their own, then I think it's incumbent on Muslims to ask themselves the same questions. That if the question is, how can a religion of love, like Christianity, broadly speaking, preach such hatred? Well, I think Muslims also have to ask themselves that how does it go from the protected status of the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, who are being challenged and threatened throughout the Muslim majority world as well? In other words, one of the equations, and I think Dr. Cizik has spoken eloquently on many components, but the political implications that Dr. Haynes spoke to, and that relationship with religion as well, is something that we can't ignore.
Yes.
My name is Li Yang, and thanks for the panelists for a very brief but very important message. But my question is, we cannot just look at Muslim itself. We have to think about a broader picture of social problem. It's really not just Muslim. So instead of just defensively say we have no fault, but the general public, they don't really understand right or wrong. So the best problem is we have to be more offensive. As you see, this is propaganda by some guy who got to be, we will define they are bad. So we can be offensive. Let's say there are violations of the law, there are violations of the human rights and human characteristics. Then we will label them, they are a criminal, they are unlawful. They are supposed to be themselves to the jail rather than send Muslims to get them out. And then we also have to be preventive. Instead of allow them to say, they occupy high position, they get all the propaganda, and they have all kind of falsification against any kind of immigrant. If they want to say South Asian are not good, they can always have some kind of rumors against somebody, defamation, libel, everything. And then we have to have a kind of diagnostic. As we said that all officials, they got to be honest, not corruptive. They have to, based on justice, rather than send the money to help some specific churches so they can sort of unjust influence their members. So unless we go this way, that we can solve the social problem, we can say based on justice, and then they have no way to say against any subgroup. So if we can go on this, we can work together, then we will have a happier world, the Muslim will be free.
I think your statement speaks for itself. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Jim Loeb from Interpress Service. I wanted to get some idea about whether you got any kinds of surprising responses from groups you may have asked to subscribe to the guide. For example, was the Anti-Defamation League asked to endorse this in any way, and if so, what was their reaction? I mean, I'm full of admiration for Rabbis for Human Rights, but you're not talking about what it would be considered a mainstream Jewish organization like the American, like the American Jewish Committee and so on. Did you ask groups that declined to endorse, and if so, why?
I will begin that discussion, and others can speak, because I think all of us have varied experiences and different experiences. We flung the net wide to seek endorsers for this, and I wouldn't claim to know why particular organizations didn't endorse. I can tell you, which I think is even more important, that the contents of the FAQ represent the best thought of a wide range of scholars. You mentioned the ADL, for example. There was considerable Jewish input into the contents. I think the one factor that, and this is my interpretation, the one factor that caused some people not to endorse was the decision we made to include some theological language in the document. We felt that was important, that if we were going to be accurately describing Islam, that we had to draw on some of the essential writings of Islam and the message of those writings. And I respect the fact, if that is the reason that some people didn't endorse, I respect that because I don't also want to be endorsing the truth of someone else's scriptures just because I respect their scriptures as they are. And I don't feel the need to impose my interpretation on them, or to come out and say in contrast to my, or in comparison with my scriptures, that that's wrong, this is right. We didn't want to get into that kind of discussion. That would defeat the whole purpose of it. And so my hunch is that theological statements were somewhat problematic for some people. And rather than, I can lament that, but I much prefer to respect it rather than lament it.
And I'll just add, you know, I've been involved in drafting, I guess now about 10 consensus statements over the last 2 decades. And so, you know, there are always groups that do sign, don't sign, and many will not tell you why they do or don't. And, you know, that's their internal conversation, and I'm not privy to that. As Welton said, we tried to get as many as possible. But I will say this, one of the surprises in this process for me, unlike many of the other agreements I've worked on over the years, is how much agreement there was on the content, and how few people who looked at it, whether they endorsed in the end, their organization did in the end, had anything to say about, you know, the content, except it's good and we like it, or you've got it right, or good for you. Many groups said, well, you know, we applaud your doing this. and even if they didn't sign on. So that kind of surprised me. I expected, I mean, it took about 9 or 10 months to draft this, and I expected a lot more pushback about why did you say this, why did you say that? So I think we did a pretty good job of checking in with some scholars and some religious liberty experts who spent time helping us fine-tune some of these answers. I'm not saying they're perfect. We could probably do better, but I think we did a good job of checking in, including some leading figures in the Jewish community, to say, look, have we got this wording right? And so when we did circulate it broadly, my surprise, people liked it. Now, why they didn't sign on, I think Welton is on to a very important point, but I just would add this. Why were we pushed in to answering a question like, what is jihad? Or what about honor killings? Now, I didn't sign up for that. As a religious freedom advocate, you know, I'm about defending people's rights to religious freedom, not about explaining to you what their beliefs are. That's not my business. And I've never had to do that before. Why now? Because this is a different moment. I'll say this, if I lived in the 19th century, the mid-19th century, I hope I would have stood up and said, that's not what Roman Catholics actually believe. Because, you know, if Roman Catholics stand up and say, you know, we don't kill babies in convents, in the basements of convents and so forth, you know, people don't believe it because it comes from the Roman Catholics. Or if the Jews stand up and say the elders of the protocol, the elders of that's fabricated, it's not true, people don't believe it because it comes from the Jews, and you know they're not telling us the truth. So I believed, and I think we believe, that at this moment in our history, like it or not, we have to stand up together and say, guess what? This stuff you're hearing is not true. Now, how do you say it's not true unless you say what is true? And that's what I don't get. If people don't want to give theological answers, that's fine. But how do you respond to nonsense? Do you just leave it to the American Muslim community to say, well, actually, if you look at it, jihad has different meanings and so forth, and Sharia has this meaning and that meaning? Who is going to listen to that? So I believe in my heart that this is the moment. We have to stand up together and say these things about Islam and Muslims that I don't think is my responsibility ordinarily to say. You can't answer the propaganda by just saying, hey, that's not true. Hey, you got it wrong. You've got to give people something to go on out there. And I'm sorry, we have left the field to these people who've been propagandizing and demonizing Islam now for 10 years and spending $40 million plus. And they have won the day. In many local congregations and communities, some members of Congress, people running for president now believe the narrative that Islam is inherently an evil religion, and if it spreads in the United States, we are doomed. They believe that because that's all they've heard. And I, for one, am not going to stand aside and let a religion be demonized and my neighbors, my friends, American Muslims, be cast as terrorists without saying something. And it's not enough to say they have religious freedom, which is what my narrative is for my work. They do. But I also have to explain to people why that mosque down the road, what it is. And I have to explain to them, you know, that what you've heard about Sharia law is just nonsense. It's just nonsense. And if 23 plus legislators can stand around and spout nonsense about something they know nothing about, at some point, somebody's got to stand up and say, wait a minute, folks, that's just nonsense. I mean, the governor of New Jersey said it. Good for him. He just said, finally, he said, this is nonsense when he was criticized for putting a Muslim on the bench. Has it come to that? You can't even appoint an American Muslim to be a judge in this country without people saying that there's something suspect about this person? Well, you know, and this is just a start. You know, we have got a lot of work to do because we're playing catch up on this nonsense.
One minor point I think I would chime in on. I think both of you spoke very well and can only speak to the question of endorsement. But I think we have to understand the distinction between endorsement and support. You'll notice that there's several large national Muslim organizations who are also not endorsers on this. And I can tell you that doesn't mean we don't have their support. There are a variety of reasons that may have come up. But working closely with Jewish and Christian organizations and congregations in New York City, I can tell you that this document is highly anticipated and will have a lot of support. They're just not endorsers, and we've got to understand that distinction, I think.
Yes, sir.
My name is Imam Benjamin Abdul Haq. First, I want to commend you all for this panel and what you're doing. This is something that I think is long overdue to take it to a new level. And I want to commend you on mentioning about the judge, because there are at least 9 to possibly 10 Muslim judges, men and women, in the United States. That's just one of the more newer ones appointed. And even among us today, we have a Muslim woman judge sitting here today, not to put her on the spot, but she's a friend of mine, she's here. And we just wanted to make that known that you all have more support than you think you do. You just haven't reached out to all of us. So as an imam and also as a African-American Muslim, I wanted to commend you all on what you're doing and say that you have a lot of our support. We were with Muhammad Ali last month in Philadelphia when he got the Liberty Award. Those types of things need to be promoted more. There's a lot of good things going on with us in America, but the media, and I'm not critical of the media, I have a lot of friends in the media, they're not really promoting or sharing enough of this information. So what you all are doing, I just want to tell you that you're doing a good job. Something else I wanted to add to this is there's a light at the top of the hill here in Washington, D.C. that many people don't know about. If I were to ask you all to raise your hand, in fact, I am asking you all, raise your hand if you ever heard of the Islamic Heritage Museum in Washington, D.C. But how many have actually gone there? So I want to go on record to invite every last one of you to go over to 2315 Martin Luther King Avenue to the first and only Islamic Heritage Museum in Washington, D.C. The phone number there is 202-610-0586. And I'm glad to see someone is from Lebanon here. I'm not sure if are you from Futures TV? Oh. Well, I'm familiar with Futures TV and Saad Hariri. But anyway. Oh, that's a good one. I hope it's the 21st century. But anyway, and I'm glad to see we can laugh and have a good time too and relax, because that's one of the things we have to learn to do as God-fearing people, not so much religious, but as God-fearing people. Learn to relax and not be so uptight. So you all doing a good job. I just want to commend you. And the last thing I want to say, or really just ask you a question. What's your next step after this pamphlet?
You want to?
Well, the immediate next step is this material is going out to the people that I mentioned in my remarks. Imam, I thought you were going to ask for an offering. But I will tell you that if you do, we can use all the money that we can get to see that this distribution goes as widely, as broadly as possible, because we did this, as Charles said so passionately, because we believe it's right. We don't have the money some people do to get it out, and so we're going to be looking for money on how to get the distribution numbers up. And we're going to work with the people who listen to us and want to cooperate with us to see that the education's done.
May I respond to that?
Sure.
We can talk afterwards.
Okay. Good.
I did want to mention one other thing that I think one of you mentioned, that the Muslim community is not, someone said it, about not mentioning, not speaking up enough about the extremism or terrorism. Many of us in our community, we don't consider it religious extremism. We consider it just simply criminal extremism. So that's the terminology many of us use. It's not religious extremism, it's criminal. What's happening with the suicide bombings and homicide killing, that's not religious, that's criminal. And if we watch it and develop the right lexicon in this 21st century, we can help clear up a lot of the language also.
I think you need to be assured that, because I safely can speak for the 4 people sitting at this table, I want you to be assured I have heard every one of us at one time or another defend the Muslim community in the United States on this charge of not speaking up enough. We are very much aware that leaders in the Muslim community here have been speaking up about that. And the truth is that some of that has just not been picked up and carried for whatever reason. But I know that you're doing a good job, and we want to encourage you to do a good job. Yeah,
Could I answer in one fashion the question of what next by saying this? The bigotry is perplexing, and of course it's to be condemned, but it can be understood and counteracted. And social scientists would say it happens through dialogue. And the document here, the Q&A, is an intent to foster that kind of dialogue. And let me quickly add this, why dialogue is so important. It's important because the way people think is not always for lack of comprehension. It's not a deficit of comprehension. It's not irrationality either. What is it? Well, it's motivated reasoning. And what that means is that people conform their processes of information to the group commitments which they hold. And so for evangelicals, the church is that strong group commitment that they hold. And if the group commitment goes astray, goes awry, by leaders who say the wrong things or pastors who have a failure of nerve, by the way, that's the name of a book by now deceased Rabbi Friedman, A Failure of Nerve. If the pastor and other leaders have a failure of nerve, then there is a kind of groupthink that develops. The only way you change that is by have leaders who speak out and condemn this bigotry, but you engage in dialogue. And that's what this document affords now, is for a great conversation to occur. And so that's why I'm here, because I happen to know that there are millions upon millions of evangelicals in this country who agree with all of us, who are with you, my friend, in spirit. And their fellow Muslims are, though, asking for these evangelicals to come forward, to step up to the plate and speak the truth as they know it. And it's sad more don't, but believe me, things are improving. They are getting better. It may be in certain communities only marginally, as reflected by controversies over a local mosque. But in general, my opinion, at least, it is in our community, because there is an engagement that's occurring, and it's important, and it's happening, and it will be enhanced by this document.
In a word for many of these local governments, which we haven't said, but good for them. I mean, it would be a lot worse today, sitting here, if governments, local governments around the country had not stood up and said, no, these people have a right to build their mosque. I think of the people in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and the local authorities there, who didn't, back down from treating the Muslim community like other communities. And then, across the country, if you look and see. So, I mean, I think that's some very good news in this, is that the First Amendment has, in fact, worked in many good ways to keep this from being worse than it is. I wouldn't, however, rely on that, because if public opinion keeps shifting towards this anti-Muslim narrative in the country, then governments may begin to do the wrong thing. And some state legislatures, in my view, have done the wrong thing, but others have not. Others have said, we're not going to pass these laws. This is ridiculous. We're not going to do it. So we have a weakening of this anti-Sharia movement in some states. In other states, it's still there, and it's still on the back burner, and it will come forward again. So our task is to make sure the government understands its role here, and its role here is very simple. Don't take sides in religion, stay out of the religion business, and protect the rights of people of all faiths or of no faith. That's the government role, and I think there's some good news in there for us that in many ways, in many places in the country, government has played its proper role under the First Amendment. Other questions or comments? Anything else anyone else wants to add before we close?
Well, I would simply say, let's together create a new heroic culture. Because people who stand up against bigotry are heroes. They're heroes to me. I think they're heroes to you. I certainly know to the panel, people who do this are heroes. That's what we're about. And so let's together create a new heroic culture.
And I would simply say that because this is a year where we're looking at the anniversary of Vatican II, I'm thinking of John Courtney Murray, the great Roman Catholic American public philosopher in the 1960s. And it was very prophetic what he said about our First Amendment protections, or religious liberty protections, and I'm paraphrasing somewhat, but he said, you know, they're not our articles of faith in this country. We have our articles of faith in our different ways on this panel and on this list in this country, and they're very important to us. If we're people of faith, they're the most important part of our lives. So they're not our articles of faith, these First Amendment principles of religious freedom that we're talking about. But he did say they are our articles of peace. They're our articles of peace. And the great danger for the future of the United States, which is now the most religiously diverse place in the world, the great danger for our future, if we're going to live with our deepest differences, is that these articles of peace are weakened, that they no longer protect everyone, that they're no longer in the hearts and minds of the American people. Because upholding that First Amendment arrangement is not going to be just with lawyers and judges. We can't rely on good court decisions, although I hope we'll get them, or local government. We also have to rely on the people, because how people live every day in Murfreesboro and all these other places, how they go to work and live, you know, their lives and their freedom really depends on how they are looked at and treated by other human beings. The government might protect them, but that doesn't protect them from that discrimination or that intimidation that they might experience day by day. So the Articles of Peace are deeply, deeply important for us if we're going to live with our deepest differences. And we hope that this will contribute to strengthening those Articles of Peace. And we invite all of you to help us in getting this word out to the American people. And thank you for being here today.